Okay, thanks for clicking there. I'm Mike Hartmann, and we are going to be having a conversation today with Nick Cleveland-Stout, who's a research fellow in the Democratizing Foreign Policy program at the Quincy Institute, which I guess is the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington. Nick is co-author with Ben Freeman, also of Quincy, of a report that came out earlier, I guess, last month, recently, called Big Ideas and Big Money Think Tank Funding in America. And the report came out at the same time as the unveiling of an online database of funding of think tanks, including foreign funding. And we're going to ask Nick about that because it caught our eye. So what are you keeping track of with this database, Nick?
Well, first of all, great to be here, Michael. Thanks so much for the invite. With this database, we are keeping track of foreign government funding, U.S. government funding, and Pentagon contractor funding of think tanks, and of 50 foreign policy focused think tanks. And so, just to give your viewers a sense of kind of what we found in the last 5 years, we found $110 million from foreign government donors to these 50 think tanks. We found $35 million from Pentagon contractors to these think tanks, and we found $1.5 billion, most of which I should say went to RAND, to foreign policy think tanks.
So, how did you pick the 50? I mean, I know this is in your report, but why don't you tell us how does one pick the 50 top foreign policy think tanks?
Yeah, so there are hundreds, over 1,000 think tanks in the U.S., and it was definitely way too much muscle in to try and look at the funding sources of all of them. But we wanted to focus on the most influential, and for that we used a list that was that's done annually by an organization called Academic Influence, and they aggregate citations and try to come up with kind of a definitive list of which are the think tanks that are really influencing policy. And so we used their list, and I should say we did substitute a few for think tanks that were based in other countries for U.S. Focused think tanks.
Hmm. Is there overlap? Would one look at the list, we'll talk about it, and be able to divide those that take foreign with those that take defense? Or are there many that take both? Or is this ending up being a discrete category in each case?
Yeah, most take both, if not all three of the categories that we looked at. For especially these major think tanks. I mean, we're talking about think tanks that have massive annual budgets, and so of course, they're taking money from all sorts of different donors. I think the biggest one on our list was for foreign government funding and Pentagon contractor funding was the Atlantic Council, and they take we saw they take funding sources from all over. So, and it also has a lot to do with disclosure, right? A lot of think tanks don't disclose anything at all, or they'll disclose some. So in those cases, you see a little bit more variation. But usually, think tanks that have a degree of transparency, you do see funding from all of those sources.
Hmm. Hmm. Just out of curiosity, does the Quincy Institute take any foreign defense contractor or government money?
We do not. No. Folks are welcome to take a look at our transparency page or our annual report where we list all of our donors. Quincy Institute, like the ones that we looked at, we are a think tank. We take funding from all sorts of different sources, um, large foundations, small net worth individuals, people on the left and the right. So please, we welcome anybody to come take a look at our own funding sources.
Hmm. And are Soros and Koch your biggest funders?
Soros and Koch, yeah, they're in the highest category. We like many think tanks, we put our funding sources in ranges, and Koch and Soros, I believe, are on the highest in the highest category.
So this is just, I'm really just asking you to sum, which think tanks on the foreign policy issues are the biggest recipients of foreign funding?
Yeah, so we've got Atlantic Council, they take $20 million. And then we've got Brookings, which they take $17 million from foreign government sources, and then the German Marshall Fund, which takes $16 million in foreign funding. And I should say all of the numbers that I'm providing
Yeah.
here and in the database, they're all conservative estimates. It's really just the tip of the iceberg, in part because of the funding ranges, in part because of the degrees of transparency. So, we want to encourage think tanks to be far more forthcoming in their funding sources, but we want to also just report as accurately as we can on what we did find.
And you're relying on their self-reported data.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's the bones of it. This entire project wouldn't be possible if at least some of these think tanks were at least partially transparent. Uh, so to put this report and database together, we went through all of the financial disclosures of these think tanks and just transaction by transaction, built out this website.
Yeah. Uh, how often is the data set going to be updated? I mean, is it going to be like real time or this? I'm foreseeing a challenge to you and others who need to be completing, data sets. Are you going to update it all the time?
Yeah, we're thinking once a year because most of the annual reports they'll come out. There are a few times in the year where they'll come out, but a bunch of them dump kind of towards the end of the year. And so we're thinking about, this is something that we're still thinking about and figuring out. But we're thinking about doing it once a year towards the end of the year, and we'll definitely notify folks through newsletters, social media, everything, when they do get updated, so people uh, can go in and sift through the data for themselves.
And I guess it would be wrong to ask which countries are the biggest sources of foreign funding. You'd have to say, because it's not necessarily from a government, of course, but you tell me, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but from which countries is are the largest chunks of foreign funding coming into American think tanks?
Yeah, it is totally accurate to say that it is from these countries themselves and from the governments. The way that we decided whether to include a foreign government source in the database or not was whether it's majority owned by a foreign government or not. Kind of trying to sort of use the metric that the Foreign Agents Registration Act might. Um, and so you see the United Arab Emirates contributing $16 million to these think tanks. You see the United Kingdom contributing $15 million across these think tanks in the last 5 years. And you see the Kingdom of Qatar contributing $9 million to these think tanks. And so you see, I think in terms of which countries are giving the most, you see a couple emerging patterns. I would say you see at the very top quite a few wealthy Gulf partners that are interested in soft power, that are interested in arms sales, that are interested in currying influence in Washington, that are interested in improving their reputations. And then you also see a lot of European allies. If you go farther down that list, it's mostly NATO treaty allies.
Hmm. Tell me how one should interpret, if I know of think tank A, that it's funded by, here I want to actually mention a country. Should I, how much should I discount a work product from a think tank that takes money from, the United Kingdom as opposed to Qatar? Are some countries or people from or organizations from or funders from some countries more wanting to lobby, purchase a particular conclusion, or how should I, as a consumer of your work product, evaluate foreign funded work product?
So I think first and foremost, what we want to get out of this project is for disclosure of conflicts of interest to be present. And so that's really the biggest thing, right? If especially, we made this project largely with journalists in mind. So we want journalists, good faith journalists, to use this database in order to uh, disclose to their readers whether there are certain conflicts of interest present. So to answer your question, right, it depends. It's very, very context specific, and I think the best thing to do is to let the readers make that decision for themselves. So if a think tank as an institution is receiving funding from one of these sources, and then they're asked about that specific subject area, you might want to take that with a grain of salt. But it is also possible that some of this might be certain funding might be core funding, and an expert is asked about something completely that's not even related to the funding source, and folks might not see that as a conflict of interest whatsoever.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the transparency score. Tell me how you arrive at that. What makes up the transparency score? And I mean, I'll just add, how subjective is it, if at
For sure.
all?
Yeah, for your audience, what the transparency score is, we wanted something as part of this project that would really focus on those think tanks that are less transparent, what sometimes get called dark money think tanks that don't disclose anything about their funding. And so we came up with this kind of binary questionnaire in order to assign this score to each think tank, since it is kind of a spectrum. It's not like a think tank is transparent or isn't. There's gradations to it, and so the questions that we included in this, that we spent a lot of time thinking about, what's most important, and these are the questions that we came up, just to give your audience a sense. The first question is, does the think tank update its donor roll annually? The second one is, does the think tank provide a publicly available list of donors? The third one is this publicly available donor list free of anonymous donors who have given $10,000 or more to the think tank? And then, does the think tank list the exact dollar amount of donations? And if not, then does the think tank list donors in four or more funding ranges? And so we went through each annual report and assigned a score based on what we saw in response to these questions, which are pretty yes no. Doesn't leave a lot of room, in my view, for subjectivity. We wanted to try and be as objective about the gradations of transparency as possible. And so, we see in some cases in the database there are think tanks that do accept a lot of these sources of funding that we're drawing attention to, depending on contractors, foreign government funding, but they are relatively transparent. I mean, I think the Middle East Institute is an example of that, where they take millions and millions of dollars from the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and then write very frequently about these countries and about these topics. But they are very transparent. If you go to their annual report, they list exact dollar amounts. They're frequently updated, and so we give them a 4 out of 5 for transparency, I think. And so there are very few think tanks in our list, I would say, that we would describe as fully transparent.
Yeah, four
It's
was
just
highest. No one got a five.
there are a couple. There are a
Oh,
couple that
got
got a 5.
it. Okay.
There was the Stimson Center. We kind of fell in love with the Stimson Center over the course of doing this project for their transparency, because they also break it down by program, which is great, at least in terms of transparency. And then also the Berggruen Institute, which is, I believe, a sole source funder. So it's a little bit of a cop out, but they also get a 5 for that reason.
Yeah. Okay. And who did not do well? Who scored low?
So
Or, the lowest.
well, luckily it's a tie between a lot of think tanks.
Yeah. Okay.
They got 0. So it's you've got some of the big names that might be American Enterprise Institute, which doesn't reveal its donor list. Although we do know that they take Pentagon contractor funding, they've sort of let slip in the past that that's the case. You've also got the Cato Institute, you've got Washington Institute for Near East Policy, you've got Foundation for Defense of Democracies. So a lot of these are pretty large and influential think tanks that don't disclose anything at all about their funders.